Sometimes, I look at an article of clothing and think, this needs a UFO abduction scene adorned upon it. It happened with this hat I made in college, one of my very first embroidery projects, and it happened again in December 2023 when I got this beautiful lavender denim jacket. I knew immediately that I wanted a classic flying saucer patch on the back, so I got sketching, and the idea just totally spiraled from there. The plan so far has been to lean into this green-purple color palette, while also going over the top with some glitter and shimmery beads and some other fun extras that I'll show you later. I started with the UFO patch and then spent most of the spring crafting the landscape. I'll show you how those turned out a bit later, but first, I want to show you how I made this beautiful beaded cow brooch. Hey y'all, I'm Stella. Let's get crafty. I started by pulling up some reference photos and drawing my ideal floating cow. I traced her onto sulky stick and stitch, but also traced individual cow parts onto heat and bond, which I then fused to some felt. When arranged together, this gave the cow a little extra padding and dimension. The effect is subtle, but I think it works pretty well in the end. I carefully ironed these in place with low heat and gentle movements, using the stick and stitch as a guide to get the placement right. This wasn't 100% perfect, but it didn't totally matter in the end. As the name implies, stick and stitch is technically sticky, but not sticky enough for my liking. To secure the pattern to the felt, I added a basting stitch in a contrasting thread about 1/8 of an inch around the cow outline, carefully snipping and pulling the pattern to cover the felt pieces. With my pattern in place, it was finally time to bead. Before we get to the bead hoard, let's talk tools. I'm using these super thin beading needles in a size 10 and later size 11 with plain old polyester machine sewing thread. I've got my trusty pair of embroidery scissors, plus a small pair of pliers and precision point tweezers, which have kind of become my embroidery tool trifecta. I've also been keeping the stack of fused felt from a previous project as a pincushion / needle minder. I keep a few needles threaded and ready to go for details and repairs as needed. And then, of course, the beads! I sorted through my hoard of beads for a few different shapes and a good range of values for my light and dark colors. I used some shiny white, ivory, and brown colors for the white parts of the cow, and purples, blues, and multi-tone blacks for the dark spots. I poured just a few beads at a time by color onto a watercolor palette. It's just what I had and ended up working pretty well. Before diving into the real piece, I also stitched some rows of beads onto a scrap of felt to quickly create a color palette that I could reference while beading. I'm definitely still figuring out the best practices with bead embroidery, so I'll probably save a more in-depth walkthrough for a future video. That said, filling in the main shape is pretty simple. It's pretty much just like normal embroidery, but instead of stitching a stitch, you stitch a bead, and the bead is your stitch. You do have to account for the thickness of the bead and your stitch length. And yeah, sometimes a sharp bead breaks your thread and you have to undo 15 or 20 minutes of work, but otherwise, totally the same as normal embroidery. But shiny. I started by using my smaller beads to outline the main shape, going ahead and filling in areas like the legs and face that are a little more detailed. I try to be very intentional with which direction I place the beads down, especially in the face. Gaps between the beads can emphasize features like the mouth and eyelashes. I even added a few single strand stitches of dark embroidery thread between those beads, just to make the face stand out a little bit more. The rest of the body was filled out section by section, placing down the darkest shadows and lightest highlights with my biggest beads where possible, and then filling gaps with smaller beads. With the main beading done, it was time to trim the felt and rinse away the stick and stitch pattern. I removed the cow from the hoop, picked out the green basting stitch around the pattern, and cut away most of the excess felt. The stick and stitch instructions say to rinse and agitate in warm water for a few minutes. Sulky recommends using a kitchen sprayer hose, but I did a test where I scrubbed with a brand new, never used toothbrush and was pretty happy with how secure the beads were. I would not recommend the toothbrush with normal embroidery though. Stick with the sprayer. I did an initial rinse and scrub, then a soak in warm water for about 30 minutes, then another rinse and scrub. I'm so nervous, oh my goodness. After letting her air dry for a few hours, I carefully trimmed back the felt to the finished size, leaving about 1/8 of an inch edge around the whole piece. This left plenty of room to avoid cutting stitches on the back. I think that's a thing. So, why am I making a glimmering bead encrusted cow? In case it's not obvious, I've been having a lot of fun fucking around outside of the gender binary for the last few years. This jacket is my way of combining my love for shiny things and boxy cut looks with some of my favorite colors thrown in for fun. I love the aesthetic of a beautiful dress with delicate fabrics encrusted in crystals and beads, but I know that I don't like the look or feel of that type of garment on myself. When I saw this Levi's jacket, I knew it was just the blank canvas I'd been looking for. In addition to the UFO scene on the back, I plan on adding some crystals, spikes, and chains to really take the look over the top. Really, this project is about queer audacity. The queer audacity to wear a jacket as bold as this, but also the queer audacity to think that I can make it all myself. But all that's for another video. Let's talk about my first 3 attempts at doing a wrapped beaded edge. I was way too excited to try the edge beading that I just went for it without thinking about hardware or even adding a backing fabric. When I was about 3/4 of the way done, I decided I want different beads, so I went back to the bead store, got the beads that I didn't get the first time, came back, and started again. And then I had a crisis about how to attach the poor cow to the jacket. I don't know why, it really could have been a simple Google search, but I agonized about this for a while. I dug through my entire collection of hardware and even briefly considered using Chicago screws before remembering I had these locking pin backs I got for the enamel pins on my backpack. This is it. Like, actually. Incredible. That being said, please enjoy these beads exploding all over my desk in slow motion as I wait for my Amazon package with the right pin hardware to arrive. I stitched 2 of these pins to a piece of felt, which was sandwiched between the cow brooch and a backing piece of felt, and a wild piece of cotton. I don't know, I just felt like throwing that in there. With just a touch of E6000 between each layer to lock everything together. Should I be wearing a mask? At least open a window. I secured all of that with a running stitch, following the beads as closely as possible, then trimmed the back layers down to the right size so I could finally get beading again. Before I get too far with the edge, I want to finally address the tail. Using 1 strand each of black, brown, and purple embroidery thread, I did 3 quick turkey rug stitches right next to the last bead in line. This textured stitch is great for furry or fluffy areas, like the end of a cow's tail. I've been trying to incorporate as many different embroidery stitches into this project as possible, and I'm really glad I finally found a place for the turkey stitch. It's pretty simple. Let me show you how to work it. Start with a thread or a few threads with no knot at the end. Pull the needle through the top of the fabric, leaving a little tail. Then come up a bit to the left and pull the slack through, making sure you keep that tail. Take the needle down slightly to the right this time. Pull the thread most of the way through, but leave a little loop. Now, bring the needle up inside the loop, right next to the tail from before. Pull the rest of the loop through and pull snug. This creates a little loop of thread that secures those tails in place. The shape reminds me of a lark's head knot that I see on zipper pulls sometimes, or even those latch hook rug kits that I did as a kid. You can fill in a larger area by working left to right in horizontal rows stacked on top of each other. Then snip and trim as needed. But back to my cow. With those stitches secure, I trimmed and shaped those threads to form a proper cow tail fluff, then continued on with the beads. By this point, I was actually glad that I had undone the edge beading so many times, because eventually I found a technique to get around all the weird little curves of my outline. The straight parts were easy enough. I could essentially just thread some beads on a whip stitch and continue row by row down the edge. I tried to tighten the thread and mush the beads towards the front with my fingers with each row to get everything really locked in place. Where I encountered trouble was with what I call the peaks and valleys of the design. In sharp corners and around tight curves, I found it hard to get total bead coverage going row by row without the rows getting totally misaligned. So, to save you some trouble, here's how I figured out how to do a wrapped bead edge. I like to start with a few evenly spaced anchor rows to define the alignment where it matters most. For peaks, this meant putting one row at the tip of the peak and a few more around either side. Then I would begin to fill in with more rows alternating sides, reducing the number of beads depending on space. Some rows only have 3 or so beads, but the excess thread is hidden between other rows of beads. For valleys, I started with one full row on either side of the valley, wherever the beads had just enough space to barely touch. Then, alternating sides and working in towards the corner, I added beads by first stringing 2 or 3 to the end, threading my needle through the gap in the valley, stringing more beads, and pulling my needle to the front. I'd sneak in a stitch or 2 to move to the other side, and repeat until there's no more room. For the spaces left over, I just couched down some green beads in the same fashion I did with the rest of the cowl. The beginning and end threads are just stuck in between felt layers and hidden by beads. Now that I've walked you through the basics, let's speed things up a bit. Let's get to the final shots of the brooch and the jacket so far. And just like that, my aliens now have an abductee. Deciding on the hardware was touch and go for a little while, but I do like where I ended up. I may use some proper locking brooch backs in the future, but I never liked the ones I used in the past, so that'll require more research. Of course, because this gal is a removable pin, my hope is to make a few more brooches that I can swap out for different occasions. I definitely need a person in a similar silly floating position, and for whatever reason, I cannot get a beaded hot dog out of my head. Let me know in the comments if you have any other ideas for what my UFO jacket could abduct. With the brooch done, I'm getting really close to final assembly of the jacket. Here's a little preview of what I'm thinking for colors and textures. That green tool is making me really excited. Thank you so much for crafting along with me. I had a lot of fun figuring out how to document and build my project at the same time, so I look forward to seeing how that workflow changes in the future. Definitely let me know what you thought. Leave a like and subscribe to see where I take this jacket next, plus lots of other cool projects in the future. Stay crafty, y'all.